Go down any supermarket aisle and you'll find an incredible selection of milk. You can get whole milk, buttermilk, 2% milk.
Just like the traditional taxi system revolted against ride sharing, so too does the education establishment feel threatened by the rise of school choice.
Low-fat milk or skim milk, organic milk, and milk with extra vitamin D.
Why do we not allow parents to exercise that same right to choice in the education of their child?
There's flavored milk, chocolate, strawberry, or vanilla. They even make milk for people who can't drink milk.
So today we're joined by Jennifer Berkshire, a journalist and podcaster who covers education, policy, and politics. Along with Jack Schneider, she co-authored A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door back in 2020. And her podcast alongside Schneider, Have You Heard, has helped many a parent like me navigate the recent acrimony and decline, honestly, of public education in a post-COVID world. You can follow her on Twitter at B is for Berkshire. And you can subscribe to the Patreon for Have You Heard on patreon.com, Have You Heard podcast. Jennifer, welcome to Why Are We Like This?
Thank you so much for having me.
And I would say that it's good to have someone from another podcast with a similarly interrogative title structure. We have to stick together. We're out here asking questions, and we have to, be asking the questions together. I want to get started by kind of level setting a little bit on some vocabulary for our listeners. Everyone, I think, has heard about school choice, right? But for a lot of our listeners, their grasp of this concept is maybe a little antiquated or frozen in amber from back when we were kids. I think that people think of parents either send their kids to public school or you cut a check to the archdiocese, and that's kind of the understanding, right? That's what we come from, that era. But it's far more complex these days. Yes, maybe they broadly understand that there are these things called charter schools or magnet schools, but not really sure what they are and how to disambiguate them in their heads. How do you broadly explain this modern landscape to people who are maybe less initiated, maybe don't have children who are school age?
Well, as it happens, I am teaching a class this year at Yale on the politics of public education. And just last night, we were discussing the sort of, the forever battle between public versus private. And I had them, we made 3 columns on the chalkboard, because they're still an old-fashioned chalkboard, one public, one private, and one gray area. And then we went around the room and students described where they had gone to school. And what was so interesting was that there were still a fair number of kids who went to their assigned district school. There were also a handful of students who went to what you were jokingly describing as writing a check to the archdiocese. They went to private schools that their parents paid for. But then there were all these gray area schools sort of in the middle. There were lots of magnet programs. There was a STEM charter school. There were programs that you had to apply to get into and lotteries. And so because I think they started out feeling like this was a very abstract difference. And what they were able to see was that for various reasons, market principles had been applied to the concept of education to try to appeal to different kinds of parents. And there was a theory of change that if you offered people more choices, it would force the existing public school structure to improve. And so in many ways, that's all it is. Just think of those columns, and what in the past was a very clear divide is now increasingly murky, especially in a state like Florida, where you have more and more public money going to fund private options.
Yeah, and that kind of gets at the core tension around your beat, right? The private education versus the public education and all of these striations of what it is. In A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door, you described education options in the context of the rhetoric like choice, marketplace, things that we're used to as Americans being the way that we're used to being marketed to. Schemes that emerge as policy pipe dreams and are later repackaged without political ideology. Can you talk us through the broad strokes of the public-private education debate, like where the various advocates place merit, and why privatization has gotten so much more purchase recently, especially in the last few years since COVID, frankly?
Yeah, so this is, as you kind of implied, this is a really old debate. It goes back decades and decades. And people may be familiar with the name of the famous libertarian economist Milton Friedman. He was really the one who came up with this idea for school vouchers where parents would get a certain amount of public funding and then they could do with it what they wanted. And so this idea kind of stays on the shelf more or less for a long time. It's very controversial. Anytime vouchers are put up for a vote, the public votes them down overwhelmingly. People are not comfortable with the idea of funding using public dollars to fund religious schools, and they're also really uncomfortable with the idea that we would pay for schools that are allowed to discriminate against kids as part of their mission. And we'll talk about that a little more later. But then what you see happening over time is, just as we started out discussing, the school landscape gets more and more complicated. And we start to think of education less as a public good, something that's going to benefit the entire community, something that's going to benefit all of us, even if we don't have kids in the schools. And instead, we really start thinking of it as a private good that is going to assist in our own advancement. So I'm going to pour as many resources as I possibly can into the education of my child in hopes that she will attend an elite university and soar to the highest possible level. And as for all those other kids, well, that's somebody else's problem. And so when we describe in the book how this over time really becomes the water that we swim in, to use a nice kind of Florida metaphor. That's what we're talking about. In some ways, what made the idea of school privatization more palatable was that we started to think of education as a private good as a country.
And I don't know if we can move forward without addressing probably the stickiest question. And I've heard you and Jack address this in the most nuanced and spend hundreds of hours of times addressing of time addressing this this very sticky question. But is there any widely accepted pedagogical evidence that charter schools or that model are inherently superior to the public school model? And I realize what a gross oversimplification that is of that question, but I think that that's probably the question that's at the forefront of a lot of those parents you alluded to, who are like, well, I got to do what's right for my kid. I have to make this individuated decision, and this is better than that.
So, and we should back up a little bit and just define what a charter school is. So this is, a relatively new concept in American education. So it comes about in the 90s really as an alternative to the sorts of private religious school voucher programs that we were talking about. And it's really a bipartisan effort. And the idea is that it'll still be a public school in the sense that it's publicly funded, and there'll be some measure of democratic oversight, but there'll be much more of a kind of market understanding of how it operates. So parents, they have to basically compete for parents, and good charters can expand, bad charters will shut down. And I think what's interesting about your question that if you asked me this question, say 10 years ago, um, I would really have been, there at that point during the height of the Obama era, there was really a concerted effort to make the case that charters were more effective, and like we tried them and they worked, and we should have as many of them as possible. But what's so interesting about the school choice debate right now is that the conservatives have largely moved on from charter schools and are instead going all in for private school vouchers and other kinds of private choice,
Yeah.
where you give the money to parents and they can do with it whatever they want. And so you will see more and more conservatives acknowledging that actually charters have not been the panacea for improving educational outcomes that we have seen. And to the extent that they have been really successful, there is a downside to them, right? That they tend to be, these are urban charter schools that use very strict discipline and a real intense focus on testing. And so there's been some backlash against what they have to do to produce the level of achievement that they've gotten. So I would say that overall, right now, you can certainly point to some success stories, but the bipartisan consensus that this was the way to go, this was going to be the future of public education in the U.S. has completely fallen apart.
And that decline, it seems like it was maybe just from the perspective of a parent whose kid happened to be starting school at this time, but it seems like the opening was created during, maybe not, maybe there's no causal relationship, I don't know, I'll ask you, but COVID really seems to have created an opening for this discourse to push further, because yeah, I do remember that period that you're talking about, and it did seem like everybody was in agreement that, hey, there's some money to be made, and we can also maybe do better better schooling, better school system. And yeah, it's pushed further to the privatization side. What's your take on that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the groups and the deep-pocketed donors that are the most excited about school privatization really saw the pandemic as a once in a lifetime opportunity. So for example, in the weeks after schools shut down in the spring of 2020, the Heritage Foundation, which is a very influential conservative think tank in Washington that was started in the 70s, they released this document that's meant to look like almost like an official White House document, and they're laying out their recommended policy priorities. And it was fascinating for education. They basically just took every Republican wish list item off the shelf and threw it in there. And they said things, like states should immediately restructure their education funding so that money goes directly to the parents and they can use it for whatever they want. Now, I know because I co host a podcast and have authored a book with an education historian that this dream dates back to the 80s, to Reagan's first term. And so what I think you're absolutely right that the door opened, but what the door opened to was a very old policy. And the places where the states that have enacted new programs or sweeping expansions of old programs were ironically also the states that really made a lot of the fact that they didn't close their schools.
Yeah.
And so, in some ways, the argument being made is really contradictory. And you think about that, coming from DeSantis, then on the one hand, he's saying we kept our schools open. And on the other hand, we have to give, parents more choice because of the pandemic.
And you know what's funny is here in Miami-Dade, I think that there was almost from the advocates and the people who are working hard on the public school side of this debate, or just working hard in public schools, there was an anticipation of that. I remember the reluctance of our school administration to announce, and waited until the very last second, until after Tom Hanks got COVID, to say, okay, fine, this is serious. Let's close down schools starting tomorrow. But you could, when you talk to the people who were, kind of in the communications or political aspect of or capacities of the district, they were like, that it wasn't a public health question. It was a what kind of blowback are we going to get question. And I think that you're dead on about that. It was like they were expecting to have this global pandemic used as a cudgel to beat them over the head.
Yeah, and think about the way that our schools are organized. So we have this incredibly decentralized system. And so that means that, that the decision making was pretty much left up to individual school districts. Sometimes it was a big district like where you are, but most districts are not big. And so the standard media narrative is that schools closed because teachers unions didn't want schools to reopen, or they demanded that they close. But all you have to do is talk to folks in states where unions are really weak or non-existent, and the same fights were happening. It's just that the people were focusing their anger at a different group of people. Yep. Right? They were furious at the school board. They were furious at school administrators. And if the anger wasn't over closings, it was over the next set of COVID mitigations. It was over questions about vaccination or masking, hybrid education, et cetera. And so really, like the same fights that we saw, happening in big cities were happening everywhere. Just people were mad at a different set of actors.
Yeah, it's I want to get to that, the villainization of certain groups and certain parties within this larger topic. But before we close the door on this specific section, I wanted to bring up a guest that you had recently on Have You Heard, a political science who was describing something that felt like a like it felt like during this period of time there's been this ratcheting effect in the legislation or the policy that comes out where it gets further to the right or into the pro privatization field, and but it's designed to not be able to ratchet backwards, right? It's intentionally designed to only go one direction, designed to sort of like slam the door shut on a public governance model after it becomes clear that the private or the charter governance isn't working. It's like this gamble that you can't take back. And here in Florida, I want to talk with you also about Jefferson County here in Florida, which was our first county to become fully taken over by charters, and a lot of unseemly details and situations going on there. But it does seem like this is designed to be a cliff that you jump off of, and it's not like other policy where it wavers over the decades back and forth depending on what the political the political tendencies of the populace are. It's like it's meant to just go one direction.
You're absolutely right. So if you look at a state like Arizona, where lawmakers have just enacted what they call universal school choice, it is so clearly intended to be something that people can't walk back. And one of the reasons is that built into the law is that there's no accountability, right? Like there's no think about all of the time and attention that's paid to standardized test scores in Florida, right? The like and how much emphasis is put on that. Now create an entirely different program that allows parents to spend the money wherever they want to, and basically say that how the schools do is nobody's business, that you're not going to collect any data, so that journalists can't write about it, so that people can't do comparisons. And at the same time, you're going to build into the law that the program gets bigger and bigger every year, right? Like that. I think that's what you're talking about, and
Yeah.
that's where you really feel that, particularly in red states, that politicians have felt like this is their opening to enact programs they couldn't have gotten away with in the past, but also to kind of disregard the will of their own public,
Yeah.
right? Like there was no demand for this sweeping universal school choice program in Arizona. In fact, voters rejected by an overwhelming margin a smaller a smaller version of that program back in 2020. And so for lawmakers to come back and say, we're going to ignore what you said to us 2 years ago, voters, and now here we've supersized it, and we're not going to allow for public debate, etc. And so I feel like we're seeing versions of that play out, particularly in states that have trifecta Republican leadership.
Yeah, and that's us too. This might be 3 for 3 or 4 for 4 on episodes where I've brought up of this new podcast that I brought up the not very well known Ocoee massacre, and I bring it up because in 1920, it's the effects of like political violence, right, or anti-democratic violence when the result of the Ocoee massacre, apart from scores of people who were killed and the political the violence that was perpetrated against the black residents just because they were trying to vote in 1920, the net effect was 60 years of not a single black resident in Ocoee. It worked. Like from that perspective of the people perpetrating it, it worked. And this stuff is brutally effective.
I think that's such a good point. And it really is, like if you're somebody who's just watching this stuff from the outside and you're wondering, like, what the hell are the Proud Boys doing at a Florida school board meeting? And it's exactly that. It's to inject the threat of menace into our day-to-day politics.
Yep, exactly. I wanted to like shift a little bit and talk about the larger incentive structures and the people who stand to gain. Honestly, I had this client in fast food in quick service restaurants, and this client is very well known for making pretty good burgers, but not much else. All the rest of their food is terrible. And this huge corporation, they looked at what they call the breakfast day part, right? And they viewed it very jealously. Their competitors like McDonald's and Starbucks own that space. My client understood breakfast to be this vast, untapped potential profit center. If we could just cut off a piece of breakfast, man, if we could own breakfast, imagine how good we would do. And I kind of think that that's the way that these private interests look at our school system budgets. Is that an accurate way to understand what animates the pro-privatization movement, like this fat hunk of money that we could get our hands on if only we can create these outcomes?
Yes, I think that that is really a good way to think about it, and think about really like the whole history of Florida. Like, what is the story of Florida, other than really, like an effort generation after generation to sort of turn on the spigot of wealth.
Yeah.
So my family actually moved from the uppermost reaches of Wisconsin in the 20s to Hollywood, Florida, because
Wow.
there was like a Florida, kind of like a roadshow guy who would go around to these freezing towns and say, there's a place for you. It's going to be great. Buy this lot. And so they show up. It's great. And then a hurricane wipes out the whole town. And I often think about that when I'm reading about school privatization in Florida, because basically what it is that, like people have figured out a way to tap into taxpayer money, and in a way, like it's a perpetual grift. And especially if you can start to remove that from any kind of measurement, like you're going to define it now. A school works if a parent likes it,
Yeah.
right? Like, think about the way that we
The
increasingly
framing.
talk about the Florida's $1 billion school voucher program. That the success is not in things like graduation rates or test scores, which in my opinion tend to be way overemphasized anyway. But it's just this question, like, well, how does the parent feel about it? And as long as somebody's choosing that school, the school is a success, and that fountain of taxpayer money continues to flow.
Yeah, and it doesn't, like, another area that they probably see as an even juicier vein is, I think about big tech and their focus on things like ride share, right? An area that has been perennially uh, dominated by union workers in a lot of ways. Delivery, union workers; teaching, union workers. If these interests, it feels like they look at teachers unions and see an opportunity to gut that entire structure and move on without it. And charter schools, by and large, I don't think they do at all have any teachers unions or union protections for their staff, right?
In some places, there are that, the schools have ended up unionizing, Chicago being one of them. There are some schools in Ohio, but overwhelmingly charter schools are non-union. And I think really, like, to see the future, you need to look at something called a micro school. And
I was going
this
to
is a
ask you
concept
about
that
this. I was going
it
to ask you
really
about
took
this.
off during the pandemic, and there's a company in Arizona that is mostly driving this trend. And the idea is that anyone could run a school, just like anyone can work for Uber if they have a car. And so you would apply to be a guide, and you would be paid per head, the number of kids who are in your charge, but they're mostly learning online. And like, you don't have to have any training or certification at all. There's some basic safety questions, like your gun needs to be locked away, etc. But the idea is that, like, like, all the things that are expensive about running a school, we're going to get rid of. Instead, it's going to be run out of your house. And think about it, like, you're now totally alone. There's no teachers union. There's no ability for you to band together with your colleagues to demand better working conditions for yourselves, but also, things like a stronger social safety net. Now
Yeah.
you're just, you're some guy who makes, like really, I think it ends up being less than like $15 an hour running a micro school.
That's one of the most dystopian things that I mean, like, when we try to as a culture portray things like that on screen, it's always in a dystopian context. It's always that something went wrong in society and now we're stuck with this. And it's fascinating that it's being sold or explored as like a serious alternative.
So I have the exact reaction that you do. I like when I hear this described, I think who could possibly think this is a good idea? But you know who thinks it's a really good idea? School choice advocates in Florida. They like it for a couple of reasons. Their sales pitch is that teaching in Florida public schools can be really dehumanizing because there's so much state oversight, right? Irony there.
Yeah.
And also that it's a potential money maker for communities that have been locked out historically. And so if you listen to somebody like Doug Tuthill, who runs Step Up for Students, which is a major Florida school choice group, it oversees the many of the voucher programs and is now like on a scale on par with the American Cancer Society. That's how many assets they have. But he will often sort of extol like this is a business opportunity for African American entrepreneurs.
Mhm.
And so the like that, so I try to open my mind to like see like what is it that is potentially appealing to people about this vision. But that to me seems like a wildly hopeful take on what really sounds dystopian and frankly pretty grifty.
Yeah, very grifty, and it's couched in a lot of the language that we are inured to. Honestly, it's the we especially, and it was a lot of it was during the Obama years. The this advent of like of entrepreneur class and like oh
Mhm.
well
Mhm.
you're not working for uh Grubhub, you're working for yourself, and it's crazy the environment that was created during the past decade to make those kinds of pitches more palatable. And when you get down to it, these folks are living on a lot of the people that work in that economy. Most of the people working in that economy are working on subsistence wages, and
You're absolutely right. And that's, I mean, it's such an apt comparison because the language is all the same. And so just as an Uber driver is, sort of a car-based entrepreneur, now we're talking about decentralizing school and letting edupreneurs call the
God,
shots. And of course, it's companies and the folks that are allied with them that stand to really cash in. But the micro school guide is, frankly not going to fare particularly well.
I wish I had like an infinity gemstone to turn time back and not have heard that phrase. I wish that I could never. I wish I could go back to the me that didn't ever know that edupreneurship, whatever is a word. We've been focusing on the charter schools a lot because that's like, and the private schools now, because those are the growth sections of the industry here in Florida. But privatization can take a lot of different forms. Last week, in sort of part one of this education topic, we had briefly alluded to, because we had a bunch of Florida parents on the call, iReady. But I wanted to follow up on that a little bit. iReady is more, because we really glossed over it. iReady is more than just this computerized learning system and testing system. It's a private enterprise that contracts with state and local education systems. Most recently, they just won a big bid in Kentucky. They make millions of dollars. It's supposed to gauge where kids are doing well or where they're doing poorly, where they need help, but it's private. It's not transparent. We don't know what they're using their data for. We don't know really much about the rules or the laws that govern it, especially if you're just a normal working parent. From a product perspective, it sucks. It's janky software. It's really bad. And it creates, I can speak from experience that it creates more stress, testing stress with the kids, often unnecessarily. I was wondering if you can talk about the proliferation of this type of services and software, all these private entities that kind of get their tendrils into the public school system, and how they fit in with this larger debate.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and we keep harkening back to the Obama era, and this was another place where you really saw this accelerate because they had this almost obsession with data. And so, anything that collected data or, that measured progress over time was good. And in a lot of ways that, that did open the door for just what you're talking about. That there are millions of these products, solutions, you might say, right? And so one that I hear parents complaining about a lot is these solutions that are offered where they're supposed to start identifying kids' career preferences
Oh
as
God.
early as like third grade, and then parents want to know, well, what's happening with little Jennifer's data? Where's all that going? Because of course, as we know from our experiences watching the evolution of the internet, that nothing good is going to happen
No.
with that data. And I actually think one of the interesting things that you can see happening in this strange moment where you have people shouting about parent rights and demanding quote unquote transparency in schools is that you do have parents who have widely different political views and opinions about things like issues like what should be taught in school, both identifying the extreme influence of corporate vendors as a problem. And so I think there could actually be some interesting pushback
Yeah.
to what is just far too much influence in the schools and far too little ability of kids to opt out and parents to push back.
Yeah, this is a great segue actually into one of my favorite you know how it is when you have this like nagging thing in your mind that you can't put words to, and then you hear somebody else put just the most perfect words to that feeling. And for me, for the that has been the idea that you and your co-host Jack Schneider have talked about, which is soft pull, hard push. And from the perspective of a public school parent, I'll be transparent here because I think this is really important stuff to be transparent about. My wife and I were professionals. We're well established. We're a little older. Our household income is over 200K, which makes us in Miami. That makes us firmly middle class. I think we're only a couple paychecks away from disaster at any given time. But 4 years into our kids' education, I can't help but feel this gravity. And you and Jack have called it the soft pull, hard push. It's the institution of education basically telling us your kid doesn't belong here. You guys you should be shopping. You should be looking around. Why do you have your kid in a community school? And it always happens in the context of us trying to better the school, going in advocacy with our advocacy hats on and saying like, hey, where's the money that was promised for the school? Where's the, how can we get more shade or coverage in the playground? This and that. We're not happy about this. We're not happy about that. And, we're members of our PTA and we participate. But the response that we get is like a market based one. It's like, so you guys, I feel like I feel like somebody's shopping on for a car, and I'm looking at a Ford Escort, and the guy's telling me, no, guy like you want an Expedition. That's what you want. And that's ridiculous to me. Can you talk about the ways that the private school sector kind of uses this class stratification with this like DAS choice and freedom and all this rhetoric that we've been talking about to get parents like me to leave, and how that erodes what remains in the public schools?
Well, I don't think I really need to add all that much because you described it
My wife says
vividly.
I'm mansplaining too much on these episodes. I need to stop mansplaining. That's what she said.
No, that was really powerful because I think for people who don't have kids, that this is a reality that is hard for them to grasp. And really what it is, it's yet another reflection of how unequal we are as a society, that you're getting messages that are like, well, okay, so you believe in the public good, but you don't want your little darling to be held back, do you?
Right.
You want to do everything you can to help. And then when you do go back and you read about the kind of case for public schools as engines of civic empowerment, and like that's where they're the sort of bastions of our democracy. It feels like a relic from an era we can't even imagine anymore.
Right.
And so the only language we have to talk about this stuff is the language of marketing and choice. And I'm remembering at a Republican National Convention back in the day, Jeb Bush, your former many-termed governor, gave this speech And he was making a push for school choice. He was a very early evangelist for this, and he describes walking down the grocery store aisle, the milk aisle, and seeing all the different kinds of milk: regular milk, chocolate milk. They've even got milk that doesn't come from cows. And why can't we have that same thing for schools? And that's what you're living through that right now. But the difference is that you're also getting these messages that if you buy the wrong kind of milk, like, things could go, the future won't work out for you, and the
Right.
stakes are so high. You said you're two paychecks away from penury, right? Like, that is the story of our education system right there.
Yeah, that's a really great point because like you're not buying milk. It's we have been able to do, my wife and I and our family have been able to enact or realize so much more by having a community and by having other parents and being like arm in arm with them versus when you turn yourself into a consumer. What you're doing, I mean, like, this is old socialist language, but like, you atomize yourself, you make yourself this one army of one, you make yourself into an army of one, and guess what, armies of one get defeated very easily.
I mean, I think that that's such a great point. And you think about how awful the pandemic was for everyone, and how, how destabilizing it was. And a big part of that was because people are so isolated. And so what do they end up doing? Well, they're on the internet, right? Well, that worked out really well. And so as you read about places that did better, it's for exactly the reason that you just described, is because you had groups of people who were able to kind of join forces. There's this old labor union word, solidarity, and we don't use it enough. But
Right.
the slogan was, an injury to one is an injury to all. And those are the places that made it through the pandemic best. And so to me, when I hear politicians arguing that we need a future that's more atomized,
Yeah.
that I find that, like, that's such a bleak vision, and I want to push back against that in any way that I can.
When you think about Black Friday and you think about kicking in the doors at Best Buy and you're going in there to grab your flat screen and get the heck out before the lines are crazy, what you're not worried about, you don't want to check in on Best Buy during the rest of the year. You don't want to make sure that their employees are well compensated. You don't want to make sure that you don't want to be a part of like the Best Buy Customer Association. You're not voting on their store management. You're just a consumer. You've been like, we strive as a country. And this is why I think I'd be interested to hear your take on this. This is why I think that this particular type of private schooling as an industry has taken such a hold in the US. And it's because we really value retail relationships. We value consumer, I keep using the word consumer, but like, I pay you money directly and then I expect the service to come back to me. I don't really know much about education abroad. Is this something that's very uniquely American? Like, it just strikes me as very Black Friday-ish.
Yes, it is very uniquely American. And I think what's interesting, if you go back to the 80s and you read the economists who were really laying out this vision, right? That our public schools were a failure because they were too democratic. And what we really needed was a system. Private schools were much more accountable because parents had, quote unquote, skin in the game.
Yeah.
And if they didn't like what was happening at the school, they could leave. And that's what we needed across the board. That was going to be our future. And in the late 80s, that still seemed like a really extreme vision. And the problem is that in the ensuing decades, that language of extreme consumerism that you were just describing is now, it completely dominates everything. You think about, like, not only do we think of ourselves entirely as consumers, but we want to rate everything now too,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So like,
The
like
The
when
Yelpification of education. Yeah.
the Yelpification, or the smiley face thing.
Oh God.
So like what are the odds that a public good that requires this kind of broader vision of people working together, what are the chances that that can survive this kind of onslaught of extreme consumerism? And I think what you're seeing in your world is just how tough that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, if you are like the Miami-Dade Water and Sewer Division, and you go and look at your Yelp page, and you're like, why is everybody rating us so lowly? It's like, well, why else would anybody go to the Miami-Dade Water and Sewer unless they're pissed off because of something, unless they're angry about something? Of course, that's going to be how it is.
Yeah, and that's that I mean, think about the political message that comes from we're told again and again that it's basically like we're powerless except to rate individuals and institutions as an angry consumer. And that at the
Right.
end of the day, like it may feel good while you're doing your rant, but it's profoundly disempowering.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit to a couple of specific names because we've been talking about this big movement, but there are also names, there are individuals who stand to gain from this activity, from this drift to the right or this hard push to the right. Here in Florida, when we think of the name DeVos, usually we think of the NBA's Orlando Magic and their late owner, Rich DeVos, who also founded Amway. In this conversation that we're having, though, the DeVos family is a critical one to talk about, particularly Rich DeVos's daughter-in-law, Betsy DeVos. Can you tell us, apart from her role in the Trump administration as the Secretary of Education for 4 years, who is Betsy DeVos, and what, if any, were your chief concerns when she was tapped for that role back in 2017? And were those concerns realized during her tenure? Because I think that those of us who know her name mostly encountered it through really sort of not great headlines. DeVos proposes this, DeVos says that. And in typical media, fashion, it didn't get to the nut of what her leadership, or maybe lack of leadership, was during those 4 years. Like, what was the net effect of Betsy DeVos, and why should we care about that name?
So just a little context. One thing that makes Florida really different from, say, the heartland of the United States is that the heartland, each state has at least one billionaire, sometimes more, who their money derives from some sort of like early mid-century manufacturing process. And
Yeah.
you've often never heard their name. They're enormously wealthy, and either they are directly or they come from a family that got really mad during the New Deal. They felt like too much power tilted towards labor and away from the brilliant business people, and they have spent the ensuing the entire rest of that century and now 20 years into this century trying to undo that, and they've actually made tremendous progress. And some of those families are the DeVos family, which Betsy married into, but also her family, the Prince family. People may know the name Eric Prince. That's her brother.
Yeah, everything that we're talking about right now in this conversation, you can just sub out the word education and put in military, and we can have the same
Yeah,
conversation about Eric Prince. But I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
absolutely. And then their passion going back decades is private school choice. And the first time that their families tried to change the law in Michigan and allow taxpayer money to pay for religious schools. Betsy was a teenager, and I thought that was so interesting, that vision of her, like phone banking with a rotary phone. I don't know if she actually did. So if you were in the heartland, you might have known her name. But it was this very extreme vision, just an utter disdain for public education. But what I discovered as I traveled through Michigan was that really their aim was to weaken the Democratic Party in Michigan, and that the like their fixation was, their animosity towards public schools had a lot to do with their loathing of teachers unions. They
Mm,
loathe all unions, but they particularly loathe teachers unions. And so you can go decade by decade and look at all the laws that they've enacted in Michigan, because the family controls the Republican Party in Michigan, and you can see them sort of undermining the structure of public education in Michigan, so that there are more and more and more charter schools, the vast majority of which in that state are run for profit,
yeah,
similar to Florida, as a
right.
matter of fact. And now they're on the cusp. They're trying to engineer a private school voucher program where very wealthy people could get tax credits in exchange for donating to a scholarship program. also very similar to what you have in Florida. So she wasn't particularly effective in getting federal programs enacted or laws changed, but she was very effective as far as using the bully pulpit. And so when you asked earlier in the program about the pandemic really opening the door to a certain kind of right-wing school privatization, she is a huge part of why. She founded a very influential school choice lobby group called the American Federation of Children that plays, very actively in all these states and is really having a big impact. So I feel like right away she got kind of caricatured as a ditz,
Yeah.
and that was a real misreading of who she is and just how much influence she's had.
Yeah, you're right. I think that if you talk to most liberals, or anti-MAGA people who are just broadly opposed to the Donald Trump political project, they would probably characterize her through ineptitude. They'd be like, "Oh,
Mhm.
she was always putting her foot in her mouth. She was kind of like a Biden or a Harris, a Kamala Harris type, where it was just like, oh my God, what did she say this time?" type of scenario. Another name down here in Miami. Uh, if you live here, you might hear the name Manny Diaz and you think of the former UM coach who got fired of last year, or you might think of our old corrupt mayor who now runs our state Democratic Party. But for this conversation, the most important Manny Diaz is Manny Diaz Jr., the former state senator from Hialeah, who led a charter school takeover that we alluded to earlier in the episode in this interview of Jefferson County. The county's entire system was, through a series of sort of dubious backroom deals and influence peddling, handed over to a charter company that, wouldn't you know it, Senator Diaz had a personal stake in. Today, Senator Diaz is now Florida Commissioner of Education, appointed by Ron DeSantis earlier this year. I recommend that anybody who wants to read up on the whole scandal and the details, check out WLRN's investigative reporting by Jessica Bakeman. She's incredible. My question for you, Jennifer, how often in your reporting have you come across similar conflicts? Because for me, it always feels like whenever there's like a big voice in the room who is pro charter or pro private school, they're only a couple of Google searches away from realizing like, oh, well, they're on the board. Oh, well, they have like a significant financial investment. Is that a characteristic from your perspective and when you do your reporting on this issue?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a book that came out a couple years ago, kind of a couple of conservative education reformers looking back over the charter school experiment. And one of the things they conceded was that they had underestimated just what a powerful driver the profit motive would turn out to be. And so you absolutely see the kinds of chummy relationships that you're talking about where, this person is palsy with this person and there's a lot of money sloshing around. And then there's Florida, and Florida is always in a league of its own. And that was, when I was learning about the political landscape in Florida in the 2000s, like that was really the first time I had come across the idea that you would have a politician like a Manny Diaz Jr. who would, essentially like run a charter school chain and would be profiting from it, but then would also be the one kind of, like helping enact laws that his company was going to benefit from. And I think in a lot of states that would still be a bridge too far.
Yeah.
But in Florida, that's just how it works.
Is there, okay, for our listeners who are probably mostly in Florida, is there something resembling like a policy or like doctrine or legislation out there that could be proposed or pushed forward or that has been successful to eliminate these conflicts of interest? Is this codified anywhere where it's like, hey guys, maybe I don't know, maybe a more a more advanced state than ours, but somebody who sat down and said like, this should go without saying, but let's just codify this. You can't profit off of doing this kind of stuff. Is there any like regulatory environment out there that would stop something like this?
Well, it's interesting, there was a big push this year to get the Biden administration to overhaul the rules that govern the federal charter school program. And this was a program started in the Clinton era, and, it's given out some unbelievable amount of money to help new charter schools start up and existing ones expand. And so basically what they tried to do was to crack down on the various ways that that people could profit, because like people don't like that it
Right.
makes the mentioning profit in the same sentence with schools makes parents in particular and good government types really uncomfortable. And so what was interesting was that the Biden administration did actually propose much tougher language, and they got just absolutely furious pushback, because what happens is that you have the charter industry as a whole close ranks. And so, even though you would think it would be in the interest of people who are all about the high performing urban charter school, that they would want to crack down on the bottom feeders, the virtual charter schools that are almost worse than not going to school. These outrageous real estate, like a lot of times what you'll have, and this is a common story in Florida, you'll have a charter management organization that's really a real estate firm. And then what they do is, sort of like lease property to a school that then has to pay outrageous rent to the management company. So all of those things should be
Yeah.
illegal, but you would think that the sort of good charter crowd would want to keep their movement from being sort of tarred by this, but it doesn't happen. They close ranks.
Yeah. All you have to do is look. I mean, like, accelerate all of these things. Whenever you privatize money, imagine what the most cynical hedge fund manager out there in the world will do with it. Whatever structure or just corrupted system that they'll use to get the maximum tax benefit out of it, they will. Like, it's like water. Whatever direction it runs, or whatever opening it has, it will fill that space. It'll find a way to do that, and it's complicated to the point of being impossible to predict. Like, you don't know what they're going to do. That's crazy. I had not heard that about the that sounds so Florida. Like, I imagine that there's probably one opening across the street from me right now.
It is absolutely so Florida. You should look into it, and then you're going to need to immediately take a shower, probably 2 showers.
My God. My last question for you before I let you go is about the danger of the other side of this blade, right? Because it is two-sided. We made a joke on our last episode about how, we see something like Centner Academy. For those that don't know, Centner Academy is down here in Miami, Florida. It made headlines last year for its policy of if teachers did get vaccinated, they would be removed from the presence of the students, because the leadership of Centner Academy believes that the vaccine is evil and the devil incarnate that is coming to take our souls. Different conversation. I think that our instinct for a lot of folks in a place like Miami, which is, people forget, overwhelmingly liberal, overwhelmingly democratic voting, our instinct to push back on these culture wars by founding our own. I joked in the last episode, I called it AOC Academy, or maybe Hillary Clinton Academy or something, which would be just as bad, right? Like, because if what we're trying to do is create a robust public system that uplifts everybody, the danger is that the impetus for this move could just find a market solution for those of us who are angry but not willing to look too deeply into it. We'll just participate in it, but on our terms. Have you seen anything like that? I don't know. What are your thoughts there?
I think that is just such a sharp observation, and I really worry about that. Think about like Ron DeSantis is really making an art of using state power to enforce particular, political views, right? Think about Don't Say Gay or patriotic education. And so you could absolutely imagine a scenario where parents start to say, I'm not gonna put up with this. Instead, I want my kids to go to AOC Academy, which is exactly what he's hoping, right?
Yeah.
That education just becomes this sort of free for all. And I think about, the first parents I ever knew who homeschooled were parents who pulled their kids out of public school during the first Gulf War,
Yeah.
because they were so put off by all the sort of jingoism. So
Right.
yes, I think you're absolutely right. And that the challenge for us is to figure out a way to really, convince parents to push back on the particular policies, but also on behalf of the institution of public education.
Last thing I'll say to our listeners is it's not super germane to this topic, so we didn't bring it up. But last week, Jennifer and her partner Jack had a great byline in The Nation. It's called "It isn't populist to defund rural schools. We are coastal elites here in Florida. We're very coastally elite, but and there's really nowhere in Florida where you can be more than like a couple of hours outside of like a major metro area. But it's a great article that also kind of cuts to the heart of a lot of the issue that we're talking about today. Our guest today was Jennifer Berkshire, co-host of the Have You Heard podcast and co-author of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. You can follow her on Twitter at B is for Berkshire, and you can subscribe on patreon.com/Have You Heard podcast. Jennifer, thank you so much for spending the hour with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
That's all for this episode of Why Are We Like This? Be sure to follow us on Apple Podcasts for more episodes or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Visit us at wawlt.com. Follow us on Twitter at Wolt Show and on TikTok at Wolt Show. You can also email us at wolt@allpointswest.net. Until next time, this was Why Are We Like This? Wolt Mafia Rising.